I still remember that day exactly. It was a Tuesday and everything seemed normal. I got up at 7 o'clock, made myself a coffee, and got dressed to go to work. My routine went as usual, nothing extraordinary, no strange feeling warning me. Yet looking back, I wonder if I could have felt something already. The day at the office dragged on. For hours, I sat in front of the computer, reading emails and attending boring meetings. My thoughts revolved only around the end of the workday. I just wanted to go home, put my feet up, and have some peace. The noise of colleagues seemed distant. My concentration waned. Around 6 p.m., I finally started my journey home. The day had grown dark and the sky was full of thick gray clouds. It began to snow and the streets were almost deserted. The quiet was pleasant in one way, but in another, it gave me a slight feeling of apprehension. It was quieter than usual. On my way home, I thought about what I could cook for dinner. My thoughts were so trivial that I barely paid attention to my surroundings, but it was as if a shadow fell over me. A feeling that something wasn't right slowly began to stir in my stomach, though I couldn't say exactly why. Little did I know that this evening was the beginning of a nightmare that would completely change my life. I was on my way home, unaware that I was already caught in the eyes of a stranger. As I turned into my street, I noticed him for the first time, a man walking a few meters behind me. At first, I didn't think anything of it. It was normal for someone to be going home at the same time, but something about him was different. His steps were heavy and slow, almost as if he intentionally didn't want to catch up but maintained his distance. I tried to calm myself. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Still, I unconsciously quickened my pace. My heart started beating faster, and I felt my hands clench in my pockets. Every step I took was accompanied by his. It was a rhythm that frightened me. The street was empty, and the cold of winter crept into my bones. Again and again, I looked to the side, as if to assure myself that everything was normal, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. The snowflakes swirled around me, but they didn't seem to muffle the sound of his steps. I decided to take a detour, suddenly turning into a small side street, hoping to shake him off. My steps became faster, almost panicked, as I plunged into the darkness of the narrow alley. For a moment, I heard nothing but the rustling of the wind. Then very softly, I heard them again, his footsteps. He had followed me. When I finally arrived home that evening, my whole body was tense. I locked the door behind me as if the lock alone could give me security. But the thought of the man wouldn't leave me. Who was he? Why had he followed me? I tried to calm myself, but my pulse was still racing. The silence of my apartment didn't feel comforting. The next morning, when I left the house, I immediately noticed something strange. It had snowed heavily during the night, and the snow covered the sidewalk in front of my house. But on this pristine white, there were footprints. They led directly to my bedroom window and back out to the street. My heart stopped for a moment. I stood there, staring at the tracks, trying to explain it to myself. Maybe they were just the footprints of a passerby who had curiously looked into the windows, but the thought didn't calm me. Whoever it was had stood right outside my window. The idea that someone could have been watching me at night sent shivers down my spine. All day long, I couldn't think of anything else. I constantly looked over my shoulder, even when I was alone in my office. The footprints haunted my thoughts, and every sound made me jump. Something wasn't right, and I began to suspect that it was only the beginning. When I came home that evening, I went straight to the window. The footprints were gone, covered by the new snow, but the feeling that someone was out there, waiting for me, remained and grew more and more intense. In the following days, I started receiving anonymous calls, always at the same time, always without a voice on the other end. At first, I ignored them, thinking it was just a silly prank, but the calls didn't stop. Every evening at exactly 10 p.m., my phone would ring, and each time I answered, I only heard the quiet breathing of a person. I tried talking to friends about it, but they just laughed and told me not to worry. Maybe it was just a technical glitch or someone bored. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Someone was out there, someone was watching me, and they wanted me to know it. With each call, the breathing grew louder, deeper, as if the caller was daring to come closer to me. It was as if they were staring at me from the darkness just a few feet away. I began to fear the ringing of the phone. It became a constant nightmare that robbed me of sleep. One evening, I decided not to answer anymore, but the phone kept ringing endlessly until I finally unplugged it. The silence that followed was almost worse. I sat in my apartment, the phone dead, but the thought that he was still watching me wouldn't let go. It was no longer paranoia, it was real. A week later, it happened. It was a cold winter evening, and I was sitting alone in my living room when I suddenly felt observed. The feeling was so strong that I automatically looked out the window, and there he stood, just a few meters away. Hidden in the shadow of the trees, I saw him. His face was half covered by the darkness, but I could make out his eyes. They stared directly into mine. For a moment, I was paralyzed. My heart stopped, my hands trembled, and I couldn't tear my gaze away from him. He didn't move, said nothing. He just stood there like a silent shadow watching me through the window. It felt as if time stood still. Seconds passed, maybe minutes, I don't know. All I felt was an overwhelming fear that gripped my entire body. Then, without a sound, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. I immediately ran to the door, double-locked it, and made sure all windows were securely closed. But inside, I knew it made no difference. He would come back, and this time I didn't know what he intended. The nights that followed were endless. A few days passed, and I thought maybe I had been lucky, maybe I had finally shaken him off. But just as I began to feel somewhat safe again, it happened. One morning, as I went to the bathroom to get ready for work, I noticed it. A message written on the fogged mirror, drawn with a finger in the steam. The words were simple, but they froze my blood. I see you. My first thought was that it must be some terrible joke. Maybe someone had written the message during a party or a visit, and the steam from the hot water had made it visible again. But no one had been here. No one had access to my apartment. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. I stood motionless in front of the mirror for minutes, staring at those terrible words. My thoughts raced. Had he been in my apartment? Had he watched me in here while I slept? The thought that someone had gotten so close to me made me shudder, even more so when I realized that this was no accident. In a panic, I began to search the apartment for possible signs of a break-in, windows, doors, even the smallest hidden spots. It was as I had left it. Nothing was broken, nothing stolen. But the message on the mirror was there. I couldn't ignore it. He had been here. That same evening, I called my closest friends. I had to talk to someone about it, share my fear before it completely consumed me. But to my horror, they just laughed. "It's probably just your own breath," they said. "You're imagining things." Every attempt to make them understand that this was serious was dismissed. They believed I was more overworked than I realized, and that my imagination was running wild. Their reactions only made everything worse. I felt not only hunted, but also completely alone in my fear. I began to distance myself from my friends. Whenever I tried to bring up the subject, I got those uncomprehending looks, as if I had gone mad. The distrust in their eyes hit me harder than I had expected. They just didn't understand. How could they? They had never seen that shadow, never heard that soft breathing. In the nights that followed, I felt lonelier than ever. Every time my phone rang or I heard footsteps outside my door, I was on my own. No one would believe me, and no one would come to help me. I started turning off my phone completely and barricading myself even more in my apartment. But deep down, I knew it was all pointless. He was out there, and it was only a matter of time before he reappeared. The nights became unbearable. Every movement in the dark made my heart race. Every slightest sound sent shivers down my spine. I could barely sleep. I sat for hours in bed, listening for every creak, every rustle outside my windows. More than once, I felt his presence, as if he were standing somewhere in the shadows outside, waiting for the right moment. It was as if he had perceived my fear as an invitation, as a sign that he could come closer. The worst part was that I didn't see him, but I knew he was there. One night, shortly after midnight, I heard it again. At first, I thought it was the wind tapping against the windows, but the sound was too regular, too precise, a tapping, 3 slow, muffled beats. My throat went dry, and I forced myself to go to the window. I looked out, but there was nothing to see outside. No person, no shadow. The snow fell softly and peacefully on the street as if nothing had ever happened, but the feeling of apprehension was oppressive. He was out there somewhere. I felt it as surely as I heard my own breath. I drew the curtains and sat back in bed. I spent the entire night awake, staring into the darkness, waiting for the next knock to come. The next day, I finally decided to call the police. I couldn't go on living like this, in constant fear and unrest. When the officers arrived, I told them everything: the pursuit, the footprints, the calls, and the message on my mirror. But their reaction was anything but reassuring. "Did you clearly see the man?" one of the policemen asked. I had to say no. "And you have no evidence of a break-in?" Again, I shook my head. They took my statements, but I could see it in their faces. They thought I was overreacting. For them, it was nothing more than the delusions of a woman caught in her own fear. They assured me that they would patrol my neighborhood more frequently, but I knew that wasn't enough. Even if they were there, he would find a way to hide. He was too cunning, too cautious, and deep down, I knew he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. The police left my house, and I felt more defenseless than ever. Even those who were supposed to protect me couldn't do anything. I was on my own, and as the darkness of evening settled over the city, the familiar feeling of apprehension returned. I locked all the windows and doors and sat in the living room, my eyes fixed on the front door. The silence became oppressive, but I knew it wouldn't last. In the next few days, it was as if a dark shadow constantly accompanied me. Even when I left the house, I felt his eyes on me. In every moment, in every situation, I sensed that he was there, somewhere nearby, watching, waiting. In the supermarkets, I kept looking around, afraid to see him. On the crowded streets, I walked faster, as if I could shake him off. But every time I thought I was safe, I felt that eerie feeling return. It was as if he was never far away, always just one step behind. At home, the feeling became even more intense. I literally barricaded myself, double-locked all the windows, and checked the locks several times. Still, I couldn't escape the thought that he was watching me through the walls. It was absurd, but it felt so real. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and with a racing heart. In those moments, I knew he was outside. Even if I heard nothing, I knew he was standing in the darkness, staring at me. This invisible connection between us grew stronger, and it was driving me crazy. I began to avoid contact with everyone, friends, family, even the people I trusted. I couldn't face them anymore without constantly feeling that he was watching them too. I was alone. It was on a cold Saturday morning when I finally decided to get something from the shed behind my house. The shed had been unused for months, and I had barely remembered it existed. But I needed a ladder to change a light bulb in the hallway, and there it was. It was the first time in a long time that I dared to enter the backyard. I opened the creaking gate and stepped into the shed. The cold air rushed towards me, and the musty smell of dust and wood reminded me how long I hadn't been there. But something felt different. A strange feeling ran through me as if I wasn't alone there. I shook off the thought, telling myself I was oversensitive. While looking for the ladder, I noticed something strange. On the floor were footprints in the dust, and they led not only in but also out, directly back to my house. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Someone had been here. Someone had used my shed as a hiding place, and I had never noticed. I looked around, my heart racing. Everything was rummaged through. Tools lay scattered. Boxes were open, as if someone had frantically searched for something. It was clear he had sought refuge here, perhaps on a night when I lay unknowingly in bed, thinking I was safe. The thought that he had been so close froze the blood in my veins. Quickly, I grabbed the ladder and ran back into the house, locking the door behind me and trying to process the horrifying discovery. He had been here, much closer than I had ever imagined. He knew where I lived. He had probably been watching me the entire time. A few nights later, something happened that finally pushed me to the brink of despair. I was lying on the couch, trying in vain to watch a series to distract myself, but my thoughts kept returning to the footprints in the shed. The idea that he was out there somewhere wouldn't let me rest. It was shortly after midnight when I felt that I wasn't alone in the room. An icy draft brushed my neck, even though the windows were closed. Unconsciously, I turned my head towards the window, which was covered by heavy curtains. Something moved there very slightly, almost imperceptibly, but I saw it. My heart skipped a beat. Carefully, I got up, slowly walked towards the window, and pulled the curtain aside a tiny bit. For a moment, there was nothing, just the dark, silent street outside, lit by distant streetlights. But then, just as I was about to close the curtain again, I saw it, a face directly behind the glass. I screamed and let go of the curtain, stumbling backward and almost falling to the floor. The face had been visible for only a fraction of a second, but I had seen it. It was pale, with deep, dark eyes staring at me through the glass. He had been watching me the entire time, right outside my window. In a panic, I ran to the front door, checked the locks, and barricaded myself in my bedroom. I lay awake all night. The man's face burned into my mind. What did he want from me? Why was he pursuing me so relentlessly? I knew he wouldn't give up. It was only a matter of time before he returned. The next day, I felt exhausted and on the verge of collapse. Fear had completely consumed me, and every night became torture. I barely dared to leave the house, and even in my own apartment, I no longer felt safe. Yet, strangely, it remained quiet for a few days. No calls, no footprints, no faces at the window. At first, I was relieved, but this calm was deceptive. Something wasn't right, I knew it. It was as if he had retreated to lull me into a false sense of security, but I couldn't relax. The shadow that had pursued me for so long hadn't simply vanished. Perhaps he was watching me now from a greater distance, ready to strike at the right moment. I tried to resume my life, but the constant paranoia was too strong. Even at work, I couldn't concentrate. I constantly looked over my shoulder, expecting to see him at any moment, but he remained invisible, and that only made it worse. One evening, when I came home, I noticed it again, that indescribable feeling of being watched. I walked through the apartment, checked every window, every door, but nothing was suspicious. Yet I knew he was there, just waiting patiently and silently, like a hunter with his prey in sight. The days stretched on endlessly, and I was paralyzed by fear. The constant uncertainty of not knowing when he would strike again was worse than any open attack. The calm before the storm suffocated me. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, and I lay awake in my bed, the blanket wrapped tightly around me. A storm raged outside. The wind howled around the house, and the rain lashed against the windows. In this dark, restless night, I was sure he would return. Suddenly, I heard it, a sound different from the storm, a faint scratching coming from my front door. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding like crazy. The scratching grew louder, and then a dull knocking followed. He was here, right outside my door. I froze in fear. Everything in me screamed to run away, but my legs wouldn't obey. The knocking intensified, as if he wanted to break down the door. Desperately, I reached for my phone, wanting to call the police, but the moment I held the phone to my ear, the knocking stopped. For a moment, there was absolute silence. I held my breath, listening, but there was nothing left but the sound of the storm outside. Trembling, I went to the door, unsure what to do, but when I looked through the peephole, no one was there. He had vanished, but I knew it wasn't the end. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in the dark, waiting for his next appearance. The storm finally subsided, but inside me it continued to rage. Since that night, nothing has been the same. The man who had pursued me for months never reappeared, at least not so that I could see him. But the feeling that he is out there has never left me. It's as if he has become a shadow that always accompanies me, even if I no longer see him. I left my apartment, moved to another city, but even here I don't feel safe. Every call, every knock at the door makes my heart beat faster. I constantly look over my shoulder, as if he could appear out of nowhere at any moment. It's as if he didn't just pursue me physically, but psychologically as well. He has occupied my thoughts, permeated my dreams. Even in the calmest moments, I feel his presence. It's a terror that eats me from within, a fear that never disappears. I often wondered why he chose me, what I had done to attract his attention. But these questions remain unanswered. All that remains is the constant fear that one day he will reappear, and perhaps he is waiting for exactly that. For the moment I let my guard down, then he will come back. It was an ordinary Wednesday evening. I didn't feel like cooking and decided to quickly grab something small at the supermarket. The store lights shone coolly as I pushed an empty shopping cart through the aisles. It was one of those quiet moments where you're completely absorbed in everyday life without any inkling that something unusual would happen. I was tired. The day had been long, and the thought of a quick dinner filled my head. I mechanically walked through the shelves, grabbing pasta sauce. A loaf of bread. The store wasn't particularly crowded. A few other people were also doing their shopping, but nothing stood out to me. But suddenly, as I stood in the canned goods aisle, a strange feeling coursed through me. I couldn't say exactly why, but it was as if the room had changed. Something felt different. The supermarket was the same, the shelves were in the same places, but the atmosphere had become inexplicably heavy. My heart began to beat faster for no apparent reason. I pushed the thought aside and focused on my shopping list. As I reached for a can of tomato soup, I saw something unusual out of the corner of my eye. At the end of the aisle stood someone, a man staring intently at me. He wasn't holding a shopping cart, no basket. He wasn't moving. He just stood there, as if he had forgotten what he was supposed to be doing. But it was his face that unsettled me. It wasn't the usual curious or fleeting gaze you sometimes get from strangers. It was cold, fixed, almost empty, as if he was looking right through me. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I could barely tear my gaze away from him. Who was this man, and why did it seem like he was only here because of me? I turned abruptly, pretending not to have noticed him, and walked to the next aisle. My heart was now beating faster, and I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe I was just imagining it all. People look at other people. That wasn't unusual. But the feeling that his eyes were still on me wouldn't let go. As I walked through the aisles, I tried to concentrate on my shopping, but whenever I felt unobserved, I secretly looked around. There he was again, not directly behind me, but always somewhere nearby, a few aisles away. As I reached for milk, he stood at the end of the aisle again, his gaze unchanged. No expression on his face, just that icy stillness. I began to observe the other customers more closely. No one seemed to notice him, as if he were invisible to everyone but me. That disturbed me even more. I thought about leaving the store, but I didn't want to admit I was scared. It was ridiculous. It was just a man in a supermarket, right? But every fiber of my body screamed that something was wrong. As I stood at the checkout and placed my items on the conveyor belt, I didn't dare turn around. The cashier spoke to me, asked for my loyalty card, but I could barely focus on her words. I could practically feel him standing somewhere behind me, his eyes boring into me. What did he want from me? As soon as I had paid for my things, I hastily packed them and left the supermarket. The cool night air hit my face, but instead of relief, I felt only panic. Yet the man was nowhere to be seen. Still, the feeling that he was watching me remained. The next few days passed normally. I went to work, met friends, and tried to forget the supermarket experience. But every time I walked through the city, it seemed as if he was there. I always saw him out of the corner of my eye, on the other side of the street, at the bus stop, even in the cafe where I usually had my morning coffee. It was never direct, never a clear confrontation, always just a fleeting glance that suggested he was there. And every time I tried to calm myself and tell myself it was a coincidence, he would appear in another place. He was always close by, and it was as if he deliberately made sure not to get too close, but never too far away either. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Perhaps I was just seeing someone who looked like him. But over time, it became unbearable. It was always the same expression, the same fixed face staring at me. Never a smile, never a sign that he recognized me, just this cold observation. I began to doubt my own perception. One evening, as I walked home, I saw him again, this time directly in front of my apartment building. He stood there in the shadow of a tree, his gaze fixed on me. The street was empty, no other cars, no people in sight. For a moment, I thought I should confront him, find out who he was and what he wanted. But as I gathered the courage to approach him, he vanished into the darkness. I couldn't pretend any longer that nothing was happening. This man, whoever he was, knew where I lived. This was no longer a coincidence. The next morning, I found a small, inconspicuous package on my doorstep. There was no sender, no label, just a simple brown box. At first, I thought it was an order I had forgotten about, but when I opened the package, my breath hitched. Inside the box was a single rose, its petals almost black with age, and a photo. It was a picture of me in the supermarket on the very evening I had first seen him. The goosebumps that crawled over my body almost made me drop the photo. Who had done this? I looked at the back of the photo. In red writing, as if drawn with a finger in blood, was just one word: soon. My stomach clenched. This was no longer a warning, it was a threat. He was closer than I had thought. In a panic, I searched my apartment, looked through every window, searched for signs that someone had broken in. But everything was as I had left it. No open windows, no broken locks. But the realization that he must have been in my immediate vicinity wouldn't let me rest. I called the police, told them about the package and the photo, but they reacted with only moderate concern. There was no evidence of a crime, just a strange delivery. They told me to call them immediately if I saw him again, but I knew that wasn't enough. The man was playing with me. A few days later, as I opened my mailbox, I again found something strange. Among the usual bills and flyers was a single envelope with no sender. It was thin, almost empty. With trembling hands, I opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. On it were just 3 words in red, scrawled writing: I am here. I dropped the letter and hastily stepped back. The mailbox was locked. There was no way anyone could have opened it without a key. Again, I called the police, but they did nothing. It's just a note, they said. No evidence, no trace of the man I kept seeing. But I knew it. He was watching me, and he made no secret of the fact that he was getting closer. The night after I found the letter in the mailbox, I was awakened by a strange sound. It was quiet outside, but I heard it clearly: footsteps. They came from outside, directly under my bedroom window. Slow, heavy steps that went back and forth, as if someone was deliberating whether to knock or just peer inside. My heart immediately began to pound. I lay stiff in bed, unable to move. The steps continued, always even, always at the same distance. I crept quietly out of bed, crawled on all fours to the window, and lifted the curtain just a tiny crack. My breath hitched. There he was, the man from the supermarket. He stood directly under my window, his eyes staring upwards in my direction. It was dark, and only the faint light of the street lamp illuminated his face, but I could clearly recognize him. He stood there as if he was waiting, as if he knew I was watching him. For a moment, I was paralyzed. Time seemed to stand still. Then he suddenly moved. Slowly, he turned his head to the side as if he had lost interest. The steps grew louder as he walked away, and then they suddenly ceased. I had never been so grateful for the darkness. He hadn't seen me directly, but he knew I was there. I spent that night awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for him to come back, but he didn't. In the following days, I tried to continue my life as usual, but it became increasingly difficult. The idea that he could stand outside my window again at any time wouldn't let me rest. Everywhere I went, I was on guard. I constantly looked over my shoulder, hoping not to see him, but he was always there, somewhere in the shadows. One evening, I was driving home late. The streets were empty, and for a moment I felt safer. But as I stopped at a red light, I glanced in the rearview mirror. My heart stopped. There he was. He was sitting in the back seat of my car, his face directly behind me, staring at me with those lifeless eyes. For a moment, I thought I was losing my mind. How had he gotten into my car? Without thinking, I jumped out of the car, ripped the door open, but the back seat was empty. He had vanished as if he had never been there. I was trembling all over, got back into the car, and drove home as fast as I could. It was impossible that he had been there, but I had seen him. I could no longer deny that he was following me. He wasn't just out there somewhere. He was closer than I had ever imagined. After the incident in the car, I was at my wits' end. I couldn't sleep or eat, and the constant fear had completely consumed me. It was as if my life revolved only around him. In my desperation, I installed cameras around my house, hoping they could provide me with evidence. Maybe I would finally see him standing outside my window, how he was following me. The first few days, everything seemed normal. The cameras only recorded the movements of neighbors, cars, and occasionally a cat. But on the third night, I saw him again. As I checked the recordings in the morning, a cold shiver ran down my spine. There he was at exactly 3 a.m., right outside my front door. He stood completely motionless, staring into the camera as if he knew exactly that I was watching him. His face was just as lifeless as ever, his eyes cold and empty, but he didn't move. He stayed there for almost 10 minutes before slowly turning and disappearing into the darkness. The recording ended, and I felt panic rise within me. What did he want from me? Why had he chosen me? The questions kept circling in my head, but I found no answer. All I knew was that he would come back, and this time he wouldn't be content with just watching. A few days later, I decided to go to my parents' house for the weekend. I needed distance from my apartment, from the city, from him. Maybe it was just my imagination, I told myself. Maybe I was just imagining all this, and escaping the familiar surroundings would help me think clearly again. But as soon as I reached the city limits, I felt it again, that dull feeling in my stomach that something wasn't right. I looked in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing, no cars behind me, no signs that I was being followed. But the feeling remained, clinging to me like an invisible hand that wouldn't let go. When I reached my parents' driveway, I saw it. At the edge of the forest, behind the trees, stood a silhouette. It was too far away to clearly recognize who it was, but I knew it. He had found me. Even here, I wasn't safe. I immediately locked myself in my parents' house, tried to tell them about my fear, but they dismissed it as imagination. They said I was stressed, that I needed rest, but I knew better. He had followed me, and this time he wouldn't disappear. That night, while I was at my parents', it happened. I was in the guest room. The window was wide open to let in the fresh night air. But in the middle of the night, I was awakened by a faint knocking. At first, I thought I had dreamt it, but the knocking grew louder, more rhythmic. Slowly, I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking came directly from the window. I got up, crept slowly to the window, and looked out. There he stood, just a few meters away, his hand raised to knock again. His face was even more expressionless than before, his eyes staring directly into mine. I screamed, ran to the door, and woke my parents. But when we went to the window together, he was gone. No sign of him, no footprints in the grass as if he had never been there. My parents were confused, thought I had had a nightmare, but I knew better. He had been there, closer than ever before, and I knew it wouldn't be long until he finally got what he wanted. Back in my apartment, nothing was as it had been before. The return was supposed to give me some security, but the opposite was true. Since that night at my parents', I knew he could follow me everywhere. The only question was when he would strike. The first night was silent, too silent. The darkness in my apartment was oppressive, and I tried to distract myself with a series. But in the middle of the night, the light suddenly flickered, first only slightly, then so strongly that the whole room was plunged into complete darkness for seconds. My heart began to beat faster. I tried to dismiss it as a power outage, but deep down I knew that wasn't the case. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching at my apartment door. My breath hitched, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Slowly, I got up, went to the door, and listened. The scratching stopped, but the feeling of threat remained. I looked through the peephole, nothing, no one was there. But the flickering lights, the scratching, it wasn't a coincidence. He was back, even if I couldn't see him, I knew he was nearby. The air seemed to grow heavier, and I felt trapped in a cage. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, locked the door, and sat with my back against it. Every second I expected him to break down the door, but the night passed without further incident. Still, I knew it was only a matter of time. The next day, I called the police again. I reported the nocturnal occurrences, the flickering lights and the scratching at the door, but again, they didn't take me seriously. "We can't do anything as long as nothing happens," they said. It was frustrating. I knew something would happen, but no one believed me. To find some peace, that evening I decided to tend to my small garden behind the house. I wanted to distract myself, feel the fresh air, and forget the constant tension for a few moments. As I watered the plants and swept the lawn, I let my thoughts wander. But suddenly, I felt that I wasn't alone. My gaze automatically drifted to the edge of the garden, and there between the bushes I saw a movement. My heart stopped for a moment. A figure quickly darted through the bushes, and for a fraction of a second I saw him, the man from the supermarket. He was there, right behind my garden, watching me. Without thinking, I dropped the watering can and ran into the house, quickly locking the door behind me. My pulse raced, and I closed the door behind me quickly. He had been watching me the whole time, and now he was back, getting closer and closer. I spent the rest of the evening at the window, staring into the darkening garden, waiting for him to come back, but there was no further movement, just that terrible silence. The following night, I was awakened by another nightmare. Drenched in sweat, I sat up, my heart pounding in my throat. But it wasn't the dream that panicked me, but the loud ringing of the phone. Who was calling at this hour? It was 3 a.m., and I hesitantly reached for the receiver. "Hello," I asked softly, my voice trembling. No answer, just silence. I waited a moment, tried to listen, but then I heard it, a faint, dark laugh. It came directly from the other end of the line, so close it froze the blood in my veins. My first instinct was to hang up, but something in me made me listen. The laughter grew more intense, slower, as if the person on the other end was taking their time to enjoy the moment. Then suddenly it stopped. Absolute silence filled the room until the line was abruptly disconnected. I sat in bed, the phone still in my hand, unable to move. I knew it was him. There was no doubt anymore. He was playing with me. And the worst part was that I had no idea what he would do next. In the next few days, I barely dared to answer the phone. Every vibration made me jump. And whenever I picked up the receiver, there was that silence, followed by that horrifying laugh. He wanted me to know he was very close. After weeks of fear and sleeplessness, I was at the end of my rope. I was overtired, paranoid, and unable to lead a normal life. I considered selling my apartment, leaving the city, just leaving everything behind. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. No matter where I went, he would find me. One evening, when I came home, I found something that finally broke me. A small note hung directly on my front door. I hesitated to pick it up, but I knew I had no choice. With trembling hands, I reached for it and turned it over. Only a single word was written on it: tomorrow. It was an announcement, a final warning that what he had been waiting for all this time would soon happen. I felt nauseous with fear, and my whole body began to tremble. What would happen tomorrow? Would he finally strike? I knew I couldn't do anything to prevent it. It was as if I was caught in a net from which there was no escape. I spent the night awake, staring at the clock, waiting for what was to come. When morning dawned, the air was heavy with silence. It felt as if the world was holding its breath. I knew something would happen today, but I didn't know when or how. Every second was torture, and I could barely think straight. Shortly after noon, I suddenly heard a sound from the front door. Someone was there. My body stiffened, and I knew it was him. Slowly, I went to the door, my hand trembling as I brought it to the peephole. And there he stood. The man who had pursued me for so long stood directly outside my door. For a moment, I was paralyzed, unable to move. Then, as if driven by an invisible force, I ran to the back door and rushed out of the house. Without thinking, I ran down the street without a goal, without a plan. I just wanted to get away as far as possible. I don't know how long I ran. Eventually, I found myself on a side street, panting and completely out of breath. I had managed to escape for that moment. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over yet. No matter how far I ran, how far I hid, he would find me, and the next encounter wouldn't end so lightly. It all started quite innocently. I often went for walks in the park, especially after a long day at work, to clear my head. It was my small refuge, a place where I could enjoy nature and organize my thoughts. It was a calm, peaceful late summer evening, and the trees cast long shadows on the path. The park was empty except for a few joggers and dog owners doing their rounds. The sun was just beginning to set, and the air was pleasantly cool. I sat on a bench, looked at the small lake in front of me, and listened to the rustling of the leaves. It was one of those moments when you feel completely safe and secure, but that feeling wasn't to last long. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone on the other side of the lake, a man who was just standing there watching me. He was far enough away that I couldn't properly make out his face, but I felt his eyes on me. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just looking in my direction by chance, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach didn't subside. After a few minutes, I got up and continued my walk, but the feeling that he was watching me accompanied me with every step I took. I could practically feel his eyes on my back. I turned around, but he was no longer to be seen. Still, the eerie feeling that he was somewhere nearby remained. As I left the park and walked home, I tried to forget the incident. It was probably just a coincidence, I told myself. But deep down, I felt that it wouldn't be the last time I saw him. 2 days later, I went to the park again for my evening stroll. The recent incident was still on my mind, but I tried to push it away. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe it really was nothing. But as I passed the same bench where I had sat last time, I noticed him again. This time, he was sitting on the bench, right where I had sat 2 days before. He wore the same dark jacket and the same cap as last time, and again he observed me without making a single movement. His eyes followed me as I walked along the path, and my stomach clenched with fear. I tried not to look, quickened my steps, and hoped he wouldn't follow me, but the feeling that he was there wouldn't leave me. He didn't stand up, didn't call out to me, he did nothing. But his mere presence completely unnerved me. As I left the park, I couldn't help but turn around one last time. The man was gone, the bench empty, but the feeling that he was watching me remained. It was as if he had burned himself into my mind, and I couldn't shake him off anymore. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, every shadow outside made me jump. I wondered who this man was and why he kept reappearing, but I still had no answer. the next few days. I tried to take my walk earlier while it was still light. I told myself it would be safer that way, but deep down I knew it didn't matter. He would find me anyway, and that's exactly what he did. No matter what time I went to the park, he was always there. Sometimes he sat on a bench, sometimes he stood at the edge of the lake, but each time he watched me, silently and motionless, as if I were the only person that mattered to him. I didn't know what he wanted, and that made it even worse. I started seeing him everywhere. When I drove to work, he stood on the street corner. When I went shopping, I saw him at the other end of the supermarket, always the same empty eyes following me. My heart raced, and I began to doubt my sanity. Was this all real, or was my imagination playing tricks on me? Every time I thought I could escape him, he reappeared. It was as if he lived in my shadow, always there, always silent. Without saying a word, the worst part was that no one else seemed to notice him, as if he was only visible to me. I told my friends about it, but they laughed it off. "You're just imagining it," they said. "It's just a coincidence." But I knew better. This man was following me. He had crept into my life, and I had no idea how to get rid of him. Soon, I barely dared to leave the house. The thought of seeing him again became an obsession. With every step I took on the street, I searched for him, my eyes restlessly scanning the crowd, looking for his familiar face, his cold, fixed eyes. But the more I looked for him, the less I seemed to find him. That was even more disturbing. I knew he was out there somewhere, watching me, but instead of being openly visible, he now hid in the shadows, in the invisible corners of my everyday life. I began to see him in every stranger. Anyone who passed me could be him. This constant uncertainty was driving me crazy. In the evenings, when I sat alone in my apartment, I felt his presence even more strongly. It was as if he was lurking in the walls, as if his eyes were watching me through the windows. Every creak, every rustle made me jump, and I couldn't help but repeatedly look out the window. But outside, there was nothing, no movement, no figure. Still, I felt him. His proximity was so palpable that it almost took my breath away. I began to lock the windows, close the curtains, and double lock the doors, but it didn't help. His presence was in my head, and I couldn't shake it off. It was as if he had broken into my life without ever truly being there. After weeks of paranoia and fear, I decided to give myself a break. I took a few days off work and decided to spend the weekend out of town, in a small guest house by the lake, far away from everything that reminded me of this man. The first few hours were indeed relaxing. The fresh air, the tranquility of the lake, and the feeling that I had finally escaped. I could almost forget what had happened in the past few weeks, but the illusion of safety didn't last long. On the second evening, as I walked back to the guest house after a stroll by the lake, I saw him. He stood at the edge of the forest, motionless, his eyes fixed on me. My heart stopped. How could he find me here? I was hours away from my home, in a place I had chosen spontaneously. It could no longer be a coincidence. This man knew where I was, where I went, every one of my movements. I felt like a mouse in a trap. The thought that I was safe nowhere made panic rise within me. I turned and ran back to the guest house without looking back. That night, I decided to leave immediately the next morning, but even the feeling of running away seemed useless. No matter where I went, he would be there, always silent and watching. The next morning, I left the guest house as early as possible. The night had been dreadful. I hadn't slept a wink, just stared out the window, expecting him to emerge from the shadows at any moment. But it remained silent, too silent. With trembling hands, I packed my things, threw everything into the trunk, and drove off before the guest house staff were even awake. As I drove along the narrow roads, I kept holding my breath, expecting to see him at the next corner, but he was nowhere to be seen. Maybe I had finally been lucky. Maybe it was just a strange twist of fate. But after an hour on the highway, I noticed it. A car had been following me for a while, neither decreasing nor increasing its distance. At first, I didn't think anything of it, but when the car took the same route as me at every turn, every exit, my heart began to beat faster. This was no coincidence. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just someone who happened to be driving the same route, but the fear in my stomach wouldn't let go. I decided to take a detour through small, secluded roads that hardly anyone knew, but the car stayed behind me. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was him, the silent observer. The man who had been pursuing me for so long was again close on my heels. It was a hunt, and I was the prey. When I finally arrived home, I felt empty and drained. The car had followed me the entire journey, and although it eventually disappeared, I knew it wasn't over. He had found me no matter where I went, and now I knew he would always be near me. I slumped onto the sofa and stared blankly, unable to calm myself. Then my phone rang. It was a message, a number I didn't know. I opened it, and my heart stopped for a moment. It was just 3 words, "I see you." My hands trembled, and I dropped the phone. How had he gotten my number? Why was he playing this game with me? I had no idea how he could keep finding me. In the next few hours, more messages came, each shorter, more disturbing than the last. "You can't escape, I'm here." I tried to ignore the messages, but they wouldn't stop. My phone kept vibrating, and each time a cold shiver ran down my spine. The threats became more intense, more personal. It felt as if he was very close to me, as if he knew exactly where I was standing, what I was doing. In my desperation, I turned off my phone, but the silence that followed was almost worse. I couldn't hear him anymore, but I felt him. He was out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment. In the following days, I could barely sleep. The messages had stopped, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger and stronger. Every step I took in my apartment, every time I looked out the window, I had the undeniable feeling that his eyes were on me. I began to be suspicious of every detail in my surroundings, the neighbors, the cars that repeatedly drove past my house. I saw threats everywhere, but the worst was the feeling that he wasn't just following me, but monitoring my every move. One morning, I noticed a small camera attached to one of the streetlights outside my house. It was so well hidden that I almost missed it. My heart pounded, and I could hardly believe what I was reading. Someone, presumably him, had been watching me the entire time. The camera was pointed at my apartment, directly at my bedroom window. I immediately ran outside and tore the camera down, but it was too late. He had been monitoring me. I wondered how many more such cameras he had installed. I searched the entire house, rummaged through every room, every hiding place, but I found nothing else. Still, the feeling that he was watching my every move remained. It was as if I was trapped in my own home, as if I could no longer be safe anywhere. The surveillance had completely derailed me. I began to question every step I took. When I left the house, I felt his eyes on me. When I went to the shops, I felt as if he was standing right behind me. It was as if he was trapped in the walls of my life, always there, always silent. One evening, as I walked through the streets of my neighborhood, I suddenly noticed something strange. Notes were attached to various lampposts and walls, blurry black and white photos of me. My heart stopped. Who had taken these photos and why? I tore off one of the notes and turned it over. On the back, in thick black letters, was written, "Soon." I felt a wave of cold panic wash over my body. The pictures were scattered all over the city, in places I often passed. It was as if he wanted to show me that he was always one step ahead. In a panic, I ran back home, locked the door, and drew all the curtains. The image of his fixed, empty face haunted me. It was as if he was everywhere now. No matter where I went, he would be there, watching me, following me. And then I knew it. This man would never leave me alone. As long as I didn't confront him, he would always be there, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. The next morning, I found something that finally changed my life. As I stepped out the door, I came across a small envelope lying directly in front of my door. There was no sender, no address. It was just a simple white envelope waiting for me. I hesitated to pick it up, but I knew I had no choice. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, on which, again, only a single word was written. Now. My heart pounded. It was no longer a threat, it was an announcement. He was here right nearby, ready to make the next move. The time for hiding was over. I ran back into the house, locked the door, and searched for my phone to call the police. But as I picked up the phone, I noticed it was silent. No signal, no connection. I was cut off, alone, and I knew he was closer than I had ever imagined. I sat on the floor of my living room, my phone held tightly in my hands. But it was useless, no connection, no way to get help. The silence in my apartment was oppressive, and the feeling that he was out there somewhere grew stronger and stronger. My gaze wandered to the door. I had locked it, but that didn't seem enough. Suddenly, I heard it, a soft sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I recognized it, footsteps. Someone was directly outside my front door. My heartbeat quickened, and I barely dared to breathe. The steps came closer, slowly and steadily, as if the person outside knew I was lurking inside, full of fear. Then I heard something that froze my blood, a soft voice, barely more than a whisper, "I'm here." The words were so close, as if he was speaking directly to me through the door. I held my breath, pressed my phone tightly against my chest, and dared not move. Perhaps he would think I wasn't home. But the steps didn't stop. They now moved slowly up the stairs, away from my door. He was going to the back door, I was sure of it. I heard the doorknob click softly. Luckily, I had also locked the back door, but the thought that he was trying to sneak in almost made me faint with fear. Whatever he was planning, I knew it would end soon. The tension became unbearable. The words he had left behind now echoed in my head. He would strike soon. In my desperation, I knew I had to fight back. I couldn't just sit here and wait for him to break into my life. With trembling hands, I began to turn my apartment upside down, searching for hidden cameras, microphones, anything that could show me how he had been watching me the entire time. It didn't take long until I found something. In a small corner of my bedroom, hidden behind a bookshelf, I found a tiny camera. It was so small that it was easy to overlook, but it was there. And it had been monitoring me the entire time. I felt a knot in my stomach as I realized that he had been watching me in the most intimate moments of my life. With a feeling of disgust and panic, I began to search the entire house, and indeed, I found 2 more cameras, one in the hallway and one directly in the living room where I spent most of my time. Each time I found one, it felt as if a piece of my security was being torn away. It was as if he had already had me in his grasp long before I even noticed. I knew there was no point in removing the cameras. It was too late. He had seen everything, heard everything. He knew everything about me. I felt helpless, like a mouse caught in a trap, waiting for the final blow. In a moment of blind panic, I decided to flee. I couldn't stay here any longer, not if he knew my every move, could watch me at any time. I grabbed my car keys and ran to the door, yanked it open, and stepped out into the cool night. My heart pounded as I sprinted to the car. I just wanted to get away as fast as possible. But as soon as I sat behind the wheel, I felt it again, that eerie feeling of being watched. I looked in the rearview mirror, and for a moment I thought I recognized his face in the darkness behind me. I shook my head, telling myself it was just imagination. But the panic within me grew. I drove off. The streets were almost deserted, but the feeling that he was near wouldn't leave me. Every car that followed me, every light on the roadside, it seemed as if he was pursuing me everywhere. The darkness around me became oppressive, and I felt fear engulf me. After a few kilometers, I stopped at a rest area. I couldn't go on. The fear had completely overwhelmed me, and I couldn't drive any further. But as I got out of the car and breathed in the cool night air, I knew there was no place where I was safe from him. He would always find me. With trembling hands, I went to a bench at the rest area and sat down. I knew I couldn't flee forever. He would come, that was certain. The only question was when. I sat there in the darkness, only the soft rustling of the trees and the distant sound of the highway around me. I was alone. Then I heard footsteps, slow, steady, and they were getting closer. My heart stopped as I turned and saw him. The man who had been pursuing me for so long stood a few meters away from me, his face as expressionless as ever, his eyes staring at me as if he was studying my every move. For a moment, I was paralyzed with fear. Then I forced myself to stand up, tried to suppress the panic. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. But he said nothing. He just came closer, slowly, almost savoring it. It was as if he wanted to relish the moment when I finally couldn't escape anymore. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew there was no escape. The darkness around us grew thicker, and I could almost feel the coldness of his gaze on my skin. There was no place left for me to hide. Then, suddenly, it happened. When he was only a few steps away from me, he stopped. His eyes, which had silently pursued me all this time, filled with an expression I couldn't decipher. For a moment, he looked almost satisfied. It was as if he had finally achieved what he had been waiting for all along. But then he turned around. Without a word, without looking at me, he slowly walked back into the darkness until he finally disappeared completely. I stood there, frozen, trying to understand what had just happened. Why had he stopped? What had made him just leave? The truth that slowly dawned on me was almost worse than the constant pursuit. He was never about catching me or harming me. It was about making me live in constant fear of him. He had driven me insane, completely controlled me without ever seeing the need to deliver a final blow. He had won, and I knew I would never truly be free, because even if I never saw him again, the damage was already done. His eyes, his face, they would haunt me forever. It was one of those nights when everything was too quiet. I was already in bed, the light was off, and I was trying to get some sleep. But just before I drifted off, my phone rang. The harsh sound ripped through the silence and made my heart skip a beat. It was almost midnight. Who would call at this hour? Reluctantly, I reached for my phone. The screen showed no number, just unknown. Hesitantly, I answered the call, unsure what awaited me. "Hello," I said softly, but there was no answer. For a moment, I thought it was just a technical problem, maybe a call by mistake. But then I heard it, a soft, heavy breathing on the other end of the line. My pulse quickened, and I tried to say something, but my voice failed me. The breathing was slow and deep, and it was as if the person on the other end was waiting for me to do something. After an agonizing minute, I hung up. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, maybe someone who dialed the wrong number, but as I tried to fall back asleep, I couldn't forget the sound of the breathing. It had lodged itself in my thoughts as if it was closer to me than I wanted to admit. I lay awake for the rest of the night, staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring again. But it didn't, and yet I knew this was just the beginning. The next day, I tried to forget the call. I told myself it had no meaning, that it was just a strange coincidence. But deep down, the feeling that something was wrong gnawed at me. This unease didn't leave me all day. As night fell and I lay down in bed again, I felt a strange tension in the air. It was as if the silence itself was waiting for me. And again, shortly after midnight, the phone rang. The same loud ringing that broke through the darkness. I knew I shouldn't answer the call, but something compelled me to. My hand trembled as I picked up the phone and pressed answer. "Hello," I asked. My voice barely a whisper. Again, there was only the soft breathing. But this time the person spoke. It was barely more than a whisper, a voice so soft I could hardly understand it. "I see you." That was all it said before the line abruptly disconnected. The words froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't just a random call. Someone knew who I was, someone knew where I was. I put the phone aside and turned it off, but even in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Someone was watching me. In the following nights, the phone didn't ring anymore, but the silence was almost worse. I kept my phone off, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Then one morning, when I turned my phone back on, I saw it, a message from an unknown number. "Why don't you answer?" the message read. My heart began to beat faster, and I could hardly believe what I was reading. Whoever was sending me these messages knew I was ignoring the calls. It was no longer imagination. I was the target of a stranger. I wanted to block the number, wanted to simply ignore all this. But before I could, another message came. "You can't hide." I felt sick with fear. Every message felt like a dagger thrust. It was as if the person on the other end was not only watching me, but also knew exactly what I was doing. I began to grow suspicious. Every time I left the house, I looked around, searching for anything suspicious, but I never saw anyone who looked directly at me. It was as if the stalker was invisible, always near, but never tangible. It wasn't long until the messages also came during the day, each colder and more threatening than the last, and no matter how often I tried to block the number, the messages always found a way back to me. The situation became unbearable. Every night when I lay down in bed, my phone would start vibrating. Messages, calls, always from the same unknown number. Every time I looked at the display, I was afraid to read it, afraid to answer the next call. But the constant vibration wouldn't let me rest. I tried putting the phone far away, but even then I could hear the buzzing in my head. The silence of the night was oppressive, and I began to lose sleep. Every night I lay awake, staring into the darkness, waiting for the next vibration to begin. It was a nightmare I couldn't escape. One night, when the phone vibrated again, I couldn't take it anymore. I answered the call, my hands trembling. "What do you want from me?" I screamed into the receiver, but the only sound was a soft laugh. It was the same dark, malicious laugh I had heard before. "You'll know soon," the voice on the other end said. Then the line was dead. I sat motionless on my bed, unable to understand what had just happened. Every word, every message seemed designed to drive me further into madness. From that moment on, I barely dared to turn off my phone. It was as if the stranger had complete control over me, and no matter what I did, I couldn't escape him. A few days later, something happened that surpassed my worst fears. I had decided to turn off my phone completely to finally find some peace. But when I turned it on the next morning, there was a new message. This time, it didn't just contain a threat. It contained my name, and not just my name, but also a nickname that only a few people knew. "Do you remember this name?" the message read. My stomach clenched. It was a nickname only my closest friends had given me when I was a child. No one except my family and a few old friends knew that name. How was it possible that the stranger knew it? I realized that this was no coincidence. Someone who knew me well had access to my life. The uncertainty of who was behind the calls and messages was unbearable. I began to distrust everyone around me. It could be anyone, a colleague, an old friend, even someone from my family. I started to isolate myself, barely leaving the house and avoiding all contact with other people. Everyone I knew became a potential suspect. I couldn't rely on anyone anymore, and the thought that someone from my inner circle could torment me like this made me shudder. After discovering that the stalker knew my old nickname, I completely lost sleep. Every night I lay awake, my phone on my nightstand as if it were a ticking time bomb. I knew it was only a matter of time before it started again, and I was right. It began as always, a single call late at night, no name, no number. But this time, when I didn't answer, another call came immediately. Then another. Within minutes, my phone turned into a constant hum. It vibrated incessantly, as if someone wouldn't stop tormenting me until I finally picked up. I tried to mute the phone, but the vibrations seemed to penetrate every surface, as if they were going directly into my head. My heart pounded so violently that I thought it would burst from my chest. Finally, under the pressure of the constant calls, I answered. On the other end, it was silent. No voice. No breathing, just silence. Then, after an agonizing minute, it began, the laughter. This time it was louder, deeper, almost as if several people were laughing at once. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I could barely hold the phone. I screamed into the receiver, demanding the person stop, but the laughter only grew louder until it suddenly stopped. The line was dead, and the silence that followed was even worse. I put the phone away, but the feeling that I was now completely in the stranger's hands wouldn't leave me. The next morning, I felt like a zombie. I had barely slept and could hardly concentrate on the day, but when I looked out the window, I noticed something unusual. A black car was parked directly in front of my house. I had never noticed it before, and I was sure it didn't belong in the neighborhood. The car stood there silently. The windows were tinted, and no one got out. My stomach clenched. I immediately felt that it had something to do with the calls. Whoever was terrorizing me now seemed to be physically close to me. All day, the car remained there. It didn't move, and I couldn't see anyone inside. But the feeling that I was being watched grew. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? A parked car outside my house. They probably wouldn't take it seriously. At night, the car disappeared, but the unrest remained. The thought that the stranger was not only calling me, but also near me wouldn't let me rest. It was as if he wanted to corner me, little by little, until I had no escape. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. The calls suddenly stopped, the car didn't return, and it seemed as if the stalker had decided to leave me alone. But the calm was deceptive. Every moment the phone didn't ring felt like the calm before the storm. One evening, as I was coming home from work, my doorbell rang. I opened it, and there stood a neighbor whom I only vaguely knew. He was an older man, friendly, but I had never had much to do with him. "We need to talk," he said, and his tone was more serious than I had ever heard from him. He told me that he had noticed strange things in the last few days. A man had been seen several times in my front yard, always late at night. The man never stayed long, just stood there staring at my house before disappearing again. My neighbor was concerned and wanted to tell me about it, just in case it was important. My heart pounded. It was as if the walls around me were collapsing. The stalker was not just an anonymous caller. He was real. He had been here, outside my house, only a few meters away. I hastily thanked my neighbor and closed the door. The thought that this man had been standing in the darkness, just a few steps away from me, froze the blood in my veins. The following night, I tried to stay awake. Every nerve in my body was tense, and I couldn't stop looking out the window, hoping to see him or fearing that he would return. Around midnight, when everything was still and dark, the light in my apartment suddenly began to flicker. It was a gentle, irregular flickering that made the shadows dance in the room. My first thought was that it might be a power outage. But when I looked out the window, all the other houses were normally lit. Only my house was affected. Then I heard it again, the faint hum of my phone. A new message had arrived. Hesitantly, I picked up the phone and opened the message. "I'm right outside your door," it read. My hands began to tremble, and I could hardly believe what I was reading. I forced myself to go to the door, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. But when I looked through the peephole, no one was there. The front yard was empty, the street still. But the flickering lights and the message on my phone left no doubt that he was nearby. He was playing with me, testing my limits. That night, when I turned off the light to finally try and find some peace, I heard a sound in the garden. It was a soft rustling, as if someone was moving through the bushes. My breath hitched, and I dared not move. The darkness in my room seemed to swallow me, and I couldn't see anything. But I knew someone was outside. Slowly, I crept to the window, my heart beating so loudly I thought he could hear it. As I opened the curtains a crack, I saw him. A figure moving through my garden, sneaking between the bushes and heading straight for my bedroom window. My stomach clenched. It was the stalker, the man who had been terrorizing me for weeks. He was now directly outside my house, just a few meters away. I wanted to scream, wanted to call the police. But I couldn't move. Panic had me firmly in its grip. Then suddenly he stopped. He turned and looked directly at the window. Our gazes met, and my blood froze in my veins. For a moment, time stood still. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. The night after the encounter in the garden, my mind was shattered. Every corner of my apartment, every sound made me jump. It was as if my apartment no longer belonged to me. The thought that he had been watching me right outside my window made it hard for me to breathe. I wondered what he would do next. Around 3 a.m., my phone vibrated again. The familiar fear coursed through me as I saw the name on the display, unknown. With trembling fingers, I answered the call, although I knew I shouldn't. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. At first, it was silent. Then I heard that laughter again, the soft, dark, disturbing laughter that had been haunting me for weeks. But this time, it was louder, almost triumphant. It felt as if he had taken another step in his sick game, as if he knew he would soon corner me. I hung up, but the laughter still echoed in my head. He wanted me to know that he was always there, that I couldn't escape him. And the worst part was that he enjoyed it. The darkness of my bedroom suddenly became oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was outside, lurking, waiting. The next day, I decided to go to the police. The calls, the messages, the man in the garden, it had become too much. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, but before I left the house, I received a final message. It appeared on my screen with a cold clarity that took my breath away. "It's tonight." My heart pounded. What did he mean by that? What would happen tonight? The thought that he had something planned, something he had been planning for weeks, made my knees weak. I stared at the message, unable to act. Should I run away? Should I ask someone for help? Or was it already too late? Every possibility that crossed my mind ended in the same nightmare. He would find me no matter where I went. He was always there, always one step ahead. This message was a warning, or perhaps it was a threat. I didn't know how to protect myself. The hours passed and evening approached. I tried to stay calm, but fear gripped me more and more. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow reminded me of him, and the message on my phone burned into my brain. Towards evening, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I packed a few things into a bag and hastily left the house. I didn't care where I went as long as I was away, but deep down I knew I couldn't truly escape. He would find me as he always had. I drove for hours through the city aimlessly, without a plan. My heart pounded incessantly, and every car that followed me made me believe it could be him. The streets were deserted, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything around me. I didn't want to stop anymore, didn't want to go back. But eventually, when the tank was almost empty, I stopped at a rest area. The air was cold, and I felt like an animal being cornered. I thought about calling the police, but what would they do? They hadn't believed me before, and besides, what if he was already on his way here? I sat back in the car and rested my head on the steering wheel. It was hopeless. I couldn't escape no matter how far I drove, how long I ran, he would always find me. This realization pierced me with cold clarity. Escape was no longer an option. It was after midnight when I drove back into the city. I didn't know where else to go. My home seemed foreign to me, but it was the only place I had. As I turned into my street, I immediately noticed that something was wrong. There was a car, a black car, parked directly in front of my house. It was the same car I had seen days ago. My stomach churned and my body began to tremble uncontrollably. He was here. This time, he wasn't just a shadow on the phone. He was physically here, right outside my door. I couldn't just go inside. My legs were paralyzed. My heart pounded in my throat. But I knew I had to do it. Slowly, I got out of the car, my eyes fixed on the black car. No light, no movement, but I knew he was there. With every step I took towards my house, the air seemed to grow heavier. As I reached the door, I felt something behind me. Slowly, I turned around, and there he stood. The man I only knew from calls and messages stood a few meters away from me, motionless, his eyes fixed directly on me. The moment our gazes met, I knew it was over. All the weeks of hiding, fear, and fleeing had led me right here. But instead of screaming or running away, I just stood there, unable to move. Then my phone rang. It vibrated loudly in my pocket, and I knew it would be the last call. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and answered. The voice on the other end was soft but clear. "It's over." I felt the world around me grow silent. The man said nothing more. He didn't move, but I could see the cold triumph in his eyes. The calls, the messages, the laughter, it had all been a game, and I had been the prey the entire time. I slowly put the phone away and stood there, staring at the man who had pursued me for so long. He made no move to leave, as if the act of terror alone was enough. Then, without a word, he turned, got into the black car, and drove away. I was left in the silence, my heart beat slow but heavy. It was over, but I knew I would never truly be free. His eyes, his laughter, they would haunt me forever.